The name Mesopotamia, which is a Greek term that describes the land that lay between two rivers, hints at the importance of geography to our understanding of the region. It's also the only Greek you'll learn in this course, but as a Hellenist, I feel I have to convey it frequently. In this lecture, I will first give a brief overview of the geography to orient you. Then we will look more specifically at water availability within the region. If you recall the Uruk vase that we discussed in the first lecture, we saw that at the bottom of the vase there was a river flowing, and around and above it was the rest of civilization, domesticated animals, human cultivation, the worship of the gods. And so that gave us a very good idea of the importance of water. After describing the water resources, we will examine the variety of environments and how these different environments promoted certain lifestyles within Mesopotamia. Then we'll take a look at what resources were not readily available, but were highly desired, and how they were acquired, usually by a ruler, as a way to convey his authority and his control of these exotic resources. Finally, I will try to unravel the web of different names that are applied to this region and explain why we use them. There is a method to the madness. A look at a map of the region shows a diverse geography of plains, mountains, deserts, and marshlands. Central and southern Mesopotamia consists of a fertile plain that lies between and to the west of the Tigris and Euphrates Rivers. This area is a low-lying area that was formed when the Arabian Plate moved under the Iranian Plate, and the depression in which southern and central Mesopotamia were created from the collision of these two plates. Northern Mesopotamia is hillier, with rolling plains that lead up to the mountains around them. One of the key mountain ranges is the Zagros Mountains that runs from the northwest to the southeast. And that was created when the Eurasian and Arabian tectonic plates collided. The Zagros Mountains run for over 900 miles, and they form the eastern border with Iran, and the northeastern area is Iraqi Kurdistan. Some mountains in this mountain range, such as Mount Ararat or Judidaj on the border with Turkey and Iran, are over 16,000 feet high. So they form a formidable border between these two regions. On the other side of the Zagros Mountains is the Great Iranian Plateau, which we will return to when we discuss the Persians. The mountains of the Zagros were home to groups of semi-nomadic peoples who often invaded Mesopotamia. So you will hear me refer to mountain tribes that come from the Zagros Mountains frequently throughout the course. We often don't have a lot of information about these tribes other than the fact that they invaded, and they form a somewhat mysterious group. The Zagros Mountains join with the Taurus Mountains to the north, and this forms the northern border of Mesopotamia. Beyond this was Anatolia, which is the term for ancient Turkey, and Anatolia was an important trading region. We will see that tin, the metal tin, was an especially important resource that was brought from Anatolia. And again, throughout the course, you'll hear me refer to Anatolian cultures, Anatolian resources. This was an area in which there were frequent contacts. We've seen the northern and the eastern borders. To the west of the Euphrates River are deserts, the Arabian Desert. And these arid regions separate Mesopotamia from the Levantine coast, which was called for antiquity, Syria, Palestine, or the Levant. These deserts were formidable and could not really be crossed until the advent of the camel in the first millennium. But that does not mean that they were desolate. We know that there are some animals that showed connections to Africa. Kings refer to ostriches that they hunted. And there were also groups of, again, nomadic tribes. Evidence for one of these nomadic tribes that settled in northern Mesopotamia at the city of Mari, which we will discuss in some detail later on, shows that even though they were nomadic, there were frequent contacts between these groups and settled cultures. The contacts were not necessarily military. In fact, the nomadic troops and tribes brought their flocks to pasture near the area of cities, so they would provide resources for the cities, presumably in return for what the cities could offer them. The deserts were, until the first millennium, when camels were used frequently, they were an effective and safe border for Mesopotamia. So it offered almost as much of a secure border as the mountains to the east and the north did. In the south were marshlands that covered most of the southernmost region of Mesopotamia. And this is where the rivers emptied and met with the mouth of the Persian Gulf. This area is somewhat exotic to us today. We know that there was settled life there and that the people in the marshlands lived in reed huts that were built on islands. They were surrounded by waterland, and their main profession, as you can imagine, would be fishing. It's a little hard to know what their lifestyle was. We do not have many texts that describe them, but we know that it was a rich area and one that had very significant contacts with the rest of Mesopotamia. So they, if nothing else, could provide trading links that would move down into the Persian Gulf. The geography that I've described creates a land that can support, in the plains, large cities surrounded by agricultural fields, especially in southern Mesopotamia. And this combination of urban and agricultural ways of life encouraged and promoted this idea of a consistent Mesopotamian culture that we discussed last time was seen with the worship of the same gods. The same lifestyle also encourages a consistency throughout the area. This is going to continue even through whatever political overthrow we may see in the course, and the same ways of life continue. One of the important distinctions between regions of Mesopotamia was the ease or difficulty of access to water. So you can imagine, as I discussed the deserts, that would create a much different way of life than we saw in the plains, in the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And this is true in other areas as well. In the northeast, rainfall usually supports enough agriculture to allow a community to supply itself. But of course, rainfall is not always reliable. Further south, in central and southern Mesopotamia, an artificial water supply was necessary. And this was supplied by irrigation from the two rivers, the Tigris and especially the Euphrates River. These rivers begin in Armenia and come through the Taurus Mountains from the north and run out to the Persian Gulf. The Tigris River is about 1,150 miles long. It's a faster river, it's straighter, and it has a deeper riverbed that made it much more difficult to exploit with irrigation canals. So, for example, the deeper riverbed meant that water had to be lifted over a high river bank rather than simply dug into the side and drained out. The Tigris was not exploited for irrigation canals until the Assyrians developed enough technology, perhaps most importantly, enough manpower, that they would use the Tigris River. And remember, they were active in the early first millennium BC. The Euphrates is a longer river. It's about 1,700 miles long, much slower, has a much more gentle gradient with numerous turns and zigzags. So this means there are offshoots of the Euphrates, that can also be used to increase agriculture. It has a much lower bank that makes it very easy to cut into for irrigation ditches and canals. Both of these rivers tend to flood, and floods were a real threat to the agriculture of the era. So we'll see that even though humans were able to manipulate their resources to some extent, they could not always rely on this, and there is still a level of uncertainty in the agricultural harvest. The Tigris and Euphrates are closest together in the flat plains of central and southern Mesopotamia, the area where we'll see cities and settlements rise earliest. Cities were most often founded to the east of the Euphrates River in order to provide sufficient access to irrigation canals leading from the river. If you look at a map of ancient Mesopotamian cities with this idea in mind, and you understand that they use the water from the Euphrates, you'll be somewhat surprised to see how far they are from it. This is caused by artificial changes, by the use of irrigation canals in antiquity and up through the modern day dams that have been built to divert the river to encourage agriculture where it is necessary today, and also by the silt that is carried by the rivers that naturally shifts the riverbed off its course. If we think about water systems, we'll see that the practical necessity of irrigation systems in the South also informs us of important social developments. First of all, the need for a large-scale project to create and especially to maintain an irrigation canal. This means that a community has to have a group of people who agreed, or maybe they were forced by some authority, to join together in this group project. So we'll see that irrigation canals are an important indicator in the growth of the city and eventually the larger states. As I said, the Assyrians were the first to use the Tigris River, so this shows us an important aspect of their way of ruling, that they were either forced by developments in the environment of the time to use a more difficult method of watering their lands, or perhaps they wanted to increase cities along the river, perhaps expand the harvest. All of this is something that we will discuss with the rise of urbanization and also with the role of the king. Many texts discuss the king and represent him as cleaning and maintaining irrigation canals. It seems as if they're constantly digging ditches. But this shows how important it is for a ruler to ensure that his people are able to have what is necessary for their agricultural survival. A final aspect of water in the area is found in the high water table of southern Mesopotamia. So remember, we have these two plates that come together, form a low-lying region in the central and south of Mesopotamia. So this brings it closer to the sea underneath, and it brings a high level of salt to the soil unless it is drained off. The salinization of the soil reduces its fertility drastically and basically converts it to a desert in which insufficient agriculture can be produced. We know that this happened in antiquity, this over-salinization of the soil, and it may be an underlying cause for some of the famines that our texts record. Let's move now from water to other aspects of the environment, specifically food resources. What did these people eat? Away from the rivers, Mesopotamia can be classified as a sub-desert, which is kind of a desert but not so bad. It certainly would provide enough sustenance for herds of sheep and goats, so you would not have to sacrifice valuable agricultural land in order to pasture your flocks. You could take them into the desert. This would require you to travel farther, but it would give you another area to use. The deserts also supported a number of wild animals that were used for meat: jackals, lions, gazelles, onagers, hyenas. Many of these animals have been hunted into extinction, but we see them reported in the text as being served at feasts in Mesopotamia. The marshes in the low-lying areas supported an even greater variety of wildlife, including several species of birds, fish, and other water creatures. And again, texts record all of these different species being brought at lavish feasts. We'll discuss these in a later lecture. The marshlands also served as a refuge for political rebels or criminals, and this is another important aspect of this environment. An 8th century Babylonian king escaped twice to the region he called the Sea Land from his Assyrian overlord, and he managed to collect reinforcements from this area. The practice continued until the early 1990s, when Saddam Hussein ordered the marshes drained to force out the marsh Arabs who opposed his rule. It's estimated that only about 10 to 20% of the marshes remain today. A reclamation project to try and restore some of this environment has been begun, but it is unlikely to be completely successful. Just too much damage has been inflicted. As we look at the southern coastline, there is some debate about the location of the mouth of the Persian Gulf. It used to be assumed that the coastline was farther inland, basically right up to the borders of the southernmost cities that were discovered. But in the mid-20th century, this idea was challenged, and geologists accepted that the ancient coastline was about the same as it was today. The issue is not settled, however. As you look at maps, you may find different levels for the ancient coastline, so just keep in mind that this is an area for future research. We will see that large cities grew where there was easy access to natural resources. And in Mesopotamia, the plains near the rivers were the great cultural centers. Rivers not only provided water necessary for a food supply for a city, but also an easy means of transportation. So goods, people, ideas can travel up and down the rivers. If you keep this in mind, the way that the rivers were used in many different aspects of life, it will help to explain the cohesiveness that is so striking, that there are similar lifestyles and that there's an easy communication between different parts of Mesopotamia. In contrast, the mountain ranges fostered much smaller, more isolated, even more independent groups. Cities appear somewhat later here. Large cities were not the norm until the end of the second millennium, early first millennium. And trade becomes a much more important, much more heavily documented aspect of society. In the north, they're much closer to key trade routes that connected east and west, especially the west to the Mediterranean. So as we look more closely at this area, we can begin to think about why people settled where they did. In southern Mesopotamia, there's not enough rainfall to supply agriculture. There's only an average of about 10 inches a year. So you need a pretty compelling reason to live there. And that compelling reason was the fertility of the soil, which can reach a 1 to 20 seed to harvest yield per year. The trade-off is that a community would have to expend a significant amount of labor to create an artificial water source draining from these rivers. And as population density in the area increased, neighboring cities began to compete for access to prime farmland, which would be the area right near the river. One of our earliest historical conflicts is the 150-year war lasting from about 2500 to 2350 BC between the southern cities of Umma and Lagash and this war was prompted by conflicts over borders and farmlands. In northern Mesopotamia, the area benefits from a much more abundant rainfall that offsets the need for irrigation. This is good because it is a hillier terrain, which would make it much more difficult to create irrigation canals than in the southern lowlands. The land in this area could be used for grazing flocks or for agriculture. Since you needed less labor to produce the necessary supply, it was easier to change what the areas were used for. In general, there seems to be somewhat less pressure for land in the north than in the south. And so from the beginning, we can see that there's a contrast between the northern and southern regions. And as we start to collect more evidence and look at this idea more closely, we'll see that the contrast continues. We've seen what the land looked like and what resources were available. So what resources were not available? There were two that were especially desirable: metal and timber. And Mesopotamian rulers wanted these resources in almost every period that we will discuss. They are not widely available in Mesopotamia itself, although there are some timber resources available in the north, but usually timber and metal were imported from both the east and the west. These are both luxury goods that were essential for the building projects that would enhance a ruler's prestige. So a ruler who wanted to show off his control of resources might use cedar from Lebanon in a temple that he was renovating. This would be recognized by visitors to the temple as something that was exotic, something that was expensive, and therefore it showed off what the king could offer to his people. Control of trade routes was one of the primary motivations, apart from land, for disputes between cities and with other cultures. And these we'll refer to these in later lectures. Historians apply different names to this territory depending on the particular era under review. And so it can seem very confusing at first. But once you learn the code, you will be able to know immediately what area and what culture was most important in Mesopotamia. And you will also be able to understand give you a rough idea of the date. Some of the names that will become familiar to you are Sumeria, Akkad, Babylonia, Assyria, and Persia. And these all reflect the dominant culture of the time. Sometimes the control is cultural, sometimes it is political. Sumeria, or Sumer, will be one of our phrases that we used most often in the first part of the course. This is the area where cities begin, so it is in central and southern Mesopotamia. It is also the language that is used in these regions, but it does not represent a specific ethnic group. We'll discuss the distinction between this a little bit later on. At the same time, northern Mesopotamia, this area that is hillier, has more mountains, is called Akkad, which is also named after the language that was used, even though both cultures used the languages interchangeably near the end of the period that we'll be discussing. Sumer, Sumerian, and Akkad, Akkadian, were most important in the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC. And it's important to note that they existed at the same time and that they were two equally important cultures. They were independent of each other until Sargon of Akkad unified the region in the 23rd century BC. In the 2nd millennium, the south and central Mesopotamia was called Babylonia, after the city of Babylon. The term is used to first describe the rise of Hammurabi, the 18th century ruler who was a lawgiver and king of Babylon, who, like Sargon, unified the north and south. The political control that Hammurabi established did not last long after his death, but the cultural unity continued for several centuries after his death. And so that means that the area continues to refer to a single culture. Assyria lies above Babylonia in northern Mesopotamia and was the leading state of Mesopotamia in the late 2nd and early 1st millennium. Assyria grew from the city of Assur, which was a trading post with connections to Anatolia, and would expand westward to the coast of Syria-Palestine, which we've discussed is also called the Levant, and even reached Egypt, for a few years anyway. While Assyria is growing and expanding in the north, Babylonia continues, and it maintained that cultural prestige that even the Assyrians respected, that would cause the Assyrians to leave Babylonia alone, to give them special treatment, even as political rebels tried to defeat Assyria from the area. By the 6th century, Assyria was defeated by an Iranian tribe, the Persians, who were from southwest Iran. They controlled Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Anatolia. They even reached the Mediterranean in Turkey and tried to cross into Europe by attacking Greece in the 5th century BC. The Persian Empire would continue until Alexander's invasion in the late 4th century BC. And when Alexander controlled the Persian Empire, he moved further east into India, creating this gigantic empire that no one was ever able to replicate. We've seen in this lecture a great variety in environment and geography in the region, and seen that they have important ramifications. The rivers, especially the Euphrates River, mitigates the lack of rainfall in the south and has certain features. It's slower, it's shallower, and is especially well suited for irrigation and large settlements. This desirability of the Euphrates creates some pressure for arable or fertile land, and this will cause conflicts. In the north, mountains were barriers and also the source of some timber. It was an area that received more rain. No irrigation was necessary for survival. And it was an area in which flocks could be pastured and the land used for agriculture as well. The deserts to the west, like the mountains, provided a natural defense and were the home to semi-nomadic tribes. The marshlands in the south are perhaps the most romantic and evocative environment for us to try to imagine a very different style of living. This was an area of fishermen and hunters. Agriculture had no role to play here. And like the mountains and even the deserts, this area could easily create communities that felt independent and even unconnected to the large cities. In Lecture 5, we will return to examine conditions for agriculture and urbanization that made Mesopotamia the site of the earliest settlements. But the next 2 lectures will focus on archaeology. First, to discuss the history of archaeology in Mesopotamia, and then the methods that archaeologists have used that inform us about how different groups took advantage of and enhanced their surroundings to create a prosperous and rich cultural life in Mesopotamia.